This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.
Hey, this is Erin with Cornell Studio Supply, located in the Gem City of Dayton, Ohio. We are a proud sponsor of this episode and the Brickyard Network. Join us June 21st to 23rd with a hands-on workshop with Simon Levin and participate in a rocket kiln wood firing with Lisa Orr. Visit cornellstudiosupply.com to sign up. We are happy to help you with all your pottery and ceramic sculpture needs with the best customer service and world-class workshops. At Cornell Studio Supply, we are owned and operated for potters by potters.
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 515 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I'm talking with Nick Lenker. His ceramic sculptures reference video games and seem to have jumped right out of a computer screen into real life. In our interview, we talk about his process of building with slabs before applying custom decals, investigating memory through subject matter, and how Philadelphia has shaped his creative life. If you'd like to see examples of his work, you can check out nicklenker.com. Before we get to today's interview, I did want to thank the folks that have donated to our fund drive. We are listener supported, so I'd like to thank Eileen McClellan and Catherine McMurray for their recent contributions. If you'd like to get involved yourself, you can do that at talesofaredclayrambler.com/donate. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. Well, yeah, let's start talking about your religious beliefs as a child and the community you were brought up in. You were brought up Jehovah's Witness, which has a strong belief in heaven. Can you talk about kind of that cosmology of the religion and how that affected you as a child?
Just to clarify a little bit, they believe in heaven, but they believe that the majority of their faithful people will be reborn on a paradise earth. So it's not exactly heaven. Okay. It's more like this utopian world where like lions will lay with like sheep. It's like, it's like, it's hard to imagine what that would actually be like, but their imagery and art is like kind of humorous sometimes when it comes to that. So I was like raised that way. They isolate their members kind of from the larger society. I mean, classic like cult-like behavior, but so there was a lot of isolation. I mean, I grew up in in the woods in like central Pennsylvania, and we would go to Kingdom Hall like 3 to 4 times a week. Fourth time being like door-to-door service. Was part of like something called the Theocratic Ministry School, where I would like do Bible talks in front of the congregation. So it was kind of like intense. In elementary school and stuff, I would not salute the flag and I wouldn't participate in any holiday activities or birthday parties. So it kind of was like a lot of like, it felt like being an outsider and looking in on this world that I wasn't a part of. I mean, does that sort of answer some of that? Like, do you have any questions about it? It's
Well,
been a
no, it's good to
long time.
clarify. I always assumed that it was the afterlife, but actually it's the utopian present, like the idea that you could create heaven on earth now.
Yeah, I mean, that's gonna happen through destruction. So that's what they sort of think. So when Christ returns, it's like gonna be Armageddon, and like they really focus on that part of
Okay.
destroying the world.
Because I've heard in your Audis talks, you parallel this, and that's why we're starting with this. Parallel that with the way that world building happens in gameplay. So that's online gaming or even now like our social media presences. So can you draw that connection between world building in games and the religious belief in the utopian present?
For me, it's like when I was a kid, like I would escape into these game worlds. And so that was it's the escape part of it, I think. Like where you can enter like a utopian world and be a part of that.
There's a couple different aims of game playing, or at least for me when I was a kid. I also escaped into games, but there was also some competition in games that I could compete in the gaming world, but I couldn't compete in the real world. So I was stronger in games. I was faster in games. I was a better, or what I thought was a better version of myself in games. And I think that was the first time I realized that I kind of had two selves. There was my real life and then there was my playing life.
Yeah.
And that seems to be a big part of the work now, is this idea of yourself in the digital world.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm attracted to that. That way you can alter your identity online in games and in social media. So you sort of create an avatar in a game world and you can control the way you look and sometimes you can change your stats, how fast you are or whatever. I mean, that's really attractive because when I was a kid, I wanted to be somebody else mostly. And I guess I still sort of feel that way. And it, you know, malleable potential. It is so it would be great to be able to change that easily and place yourself into a different, situation like whenever you felt like it. And for some, and I mean, I feel like that world it's coming soon. It's like even, I mean, you can do it now, like through video games and to a certain extent, social media, but like, with the creation of AI, I think it's going to go there eventually. So we're all just living in our fake worlds.
I'm interested in how we seek the freedom of the digital world at times, either through social media or gaming. But the part that doesn't have a parallel is the emotional life. In one of your talks, you talked about how like our social media presence is almost our memory, that it's like a very public form of making memories or solidifying those memories. But what's weird is when you get far enough away from even your own social media presence, you lose the emotional tie to it. And then all of a sudden it becomes like a third thing. You don't remember what you felt at the moment. You now feel something separate. So can you talk about how memory plays into the objects that you choose to make?
I mean, some of the objects, they are from particular memories from my past. When I started this body of work, it was very much sort of an exploration of my identity. So I was taking these people that have like a really big impact on my life. And so these people, like I would absorb some of their identity into my own. So like mentors or like, just important people in your life, take a memory from that person, an intimate memory, and then create something related to that memory that sort of like embodied their identity in some way. Sometimes that would be like a story that someone told me, like about an emotional time that they had, or it's a shared memory between me and like my mother or something. There was one object, this elephant that I made that was connected to her. So it was like a memory of going to like a Hallmark store and picking out like something I wanted from the store. And because we didn't really get a lot of birthday presents or Christmas presents that much, like it was like it felt really meaningful to me. And it always stuck with me, like this memory of going to get this thing. Um,
When you have shows, you'll often have a lot of different objects. And I think me as the viewer, I'm trying to figure out like, how does this connect to this? Does that connect to that?
yeah. So the Candela show was like kind of, it's like all of this past work, but in the past I have done sort of like these installation exhibitions where it's like video and objects that sort of appear in space and within the video. So there's a little bit more clear connection there sometimes, with, the connection between what's happening on the screen and what's happening in the space. A lot of them have like very particular memories involved in them. So it's kind of like a souvenir of time that you can't really connect to anymore.
Yeah, there was an installation that you did 2017 recreation first person, and that one specifically in the room, it was gridded. Like the walls were gridded, the floors gridded, so you felt like you were walking into the inventory of a game, like the screen before you start, where you can kind of pick whatever you're going to work with within that game. But it did this weird thing to the space where the walls, the floor, and the ceiling started to flatten or get farther away depending on where you're. This is what I'm assuming, depending on where you're in the room. So then the objects that you were making and the video pieces, you were in this world that was disorienting, and then the objects help you orient yourself. So can you talk about that specific installation and kind of the goals for that work?
That show was like created to like sort of explore my identity, picking apart pieces of my identity to sort of strip down to this first person or something, something that was originally me. For the gridded part of that show, it was kind of drawing from, yeah, inventory screens in gaming, where you have like these objects within these boxes that contain like, it's like defining a space of the object that exists within. So it's a sculptural space within a virtual environment, which I think is interesting as far as sculpture goes. So you're thinking about space, and space in a virtual world is also space. It's just but also looking at like sort of like 3D modeling programs and like how those things just define space on a 2D surface, sort of a void space waiting for something to happen. That's part of it. And then the holodeck from Star Trek, like, like where anything is possible. That was like a main influence. But also like that is definitely drawing from the same sort of stuff.
So I wanted to describe for the viewer or the listener how you actually make these objects. So in the digital world, you have essentially almost like a hollow presence that the surface of their body is connected by either points like a vector, like different points that go around the body, and then they're all kind of stitched together to make that digital self. But you're actually making that in 3D. How do you actually build this stuff?
Well, I started getting into like digital work right after undergrad because I was super broke and didn't have any money and no studio and no access to kilns or anything. So I would I still had access to the computer lab at UArts. And so I would go there and like just pull images off the internet to sort of use as like materials for photo collage. Because I didn't have the internet either. But I had Photoshop on my computer. So I would make these like digital images, digital collage, because it was free. I could do it. But then I found out that you could, make these digitally printed decals. And so I eventually got to a point where I was making these narrative vessels, where they would be entirely covered with decals. And I just figured out how to do it. I mean, it works best when it's on a flat surface. So a cylinder would work as long as it's like, straight. But it's making like paper templates of the form, and making that as precise as possible. And then I'll either scan it or photograph it and then put it into Photoshop at scale so I can make the skin for the three-dimensional object.
So everything starts paper then? Like your sketching, quote unquote, is actually you working with paper to figure out the form?
No, I'll build it with slabs. Just build it with slabs without. I mean, sometimes I'll like sketch something before I start, but because clay like shrinks through the entire process, like I have to get the size that I need for the decals, it has to be glaze fired at that point. Then it doesn't shrink anymore, and so you can take the paper template off the glazed form after I call them like kind of like blanks because it's like they're just naked. But so that's how I do it. It's like taking the paper template off of the glazed form after it's gone through its higher firing.
And then you're doing custom decal printing that then becomes the skin or the visual surface that the person sees. But there's kind of ceramic color, like the history of ceramics, glazes, copper, cobalt, all the things we know. But then when you do custom printed decals, it has those materials, but it is a modern sense of color. So how did you get a color scheme or maybe understand color or sense of color theory that feels a little digital, but that still's within the ceramic realm?
Wow, it's a tough question. I wouldn't say that I'm like particularly good with color. Like I have a custom decal printer that I fortunately could have I bought. And that has like a particular range of color. Like it can't achieve everything. Like it struggles with like, lime green and like purple, lots like subtleties of color. So it will tend to, if you have a certain red in it, will go to a kind of this orange, red orange color. It's not, I mean, I try to use the color range to my advantage and sort of work within that spectrum. But it can be frustrating sometimes, especially when you're like looking at these digital files and like they have like all the vibrancy that you would want. But I have a color profile so I can convert like my file to see what it would look like once it's like printed in the limited color range.
I haven't thought of that. So you have a preset, so you can see almost what it will look like on the
I mean,
computer.
it does vary sometimes. But you can kind of see like when you print it, like if there's too much like blue in it or something, Um, so I can make adjustments within Photoshop to like alter the end result. I just recently had to do that because I don't know, grays will go sort of blue if you have like certain, so I just adjust some of the color and then print it again. But yeah, it can be frustrating. Like, I mean, that's part of the reason like I use decals is like because I was just frustrated with like the unpredictability of glazing and like being frustrated with like what would come from that. Which I'm assuming like most beginners struggle with.
Well, it was interesting to track your work through time. I was looking at like the really early stuff, 2011, that's on your website. And it seems like you're talking about identity and questioning identity in a way, and kind of the destruction of identity in that really early work. But then there's something about the way that this is built, the IRL objects or subjects, that process actually describes the fragmentation of our identities visually better than just about anything else.
Hmm.
So it's like your process is your content, which I think as artists, like that's great. That's like a home run, you know, when you,
Yeah.
when the process itself can describe a core part of the content. But it also just makes me think about how our brains will put together images and anthropomorphize something that almost is like so loosely held together that there's nothing there. So what I mean by that is like sometimes in that Candela show, as I'd walk around your objects, the sculptures, at times I was confused, and then there were times in which I like got it, like there was recognition. So I'm wondering, like, as you as the maker, how much are you controlling that familiarity of the object versus that kind of enticing confusion of like, what is this thing?
Are you meaning like confusion with like the form and like
Yeah,
I do like the interplay between the form of the thing and the surface, obviously, as all ceramics people would probably say. But yeah, it's hard to know like when how detailed to make something. Like because you could have as many surfaces as you want, like to make that, more high res, I'm just sort of say. But like this sort of low poly form making is I've described it in a way where it's like objects trying to like become more than they are. And I think as like, if you say object, we as a person want to become more than we are. Um, so in like social media, like you're sort of like building your identity through images, but they're also so surface, so it's kind of a similar way where it's the object is sort of like a crude version of itself, and it becomes like more through the application of these images overlaid on top of its form. So confusing, but I think it's sort of the point.
I wanted to talk about there's this piece, Not My Brother's Keeper, which essentially is Cain and Abel, right? That's the where that comes from. Can you describe that work?
So I made that in response to sort of like I guess political stuff. Like really, like I made it around the time like when you just like on constantly like seeing like Twitter fights and like stuff like that. I mean, still seeing that, but it was a lot. I felt like it was a much newer thing like during the Trump years. But I was also thinking about like, a breakup or something, or the disconnect with like family sometimes, and all that stuff is kind of connected in some way. But within that sculpture, I was like, I'm referencing like multiple Cain and Abel images. I think one is a Rubens painting, and then the other one is a William Blake painting, and then um, the images are the skin of it is me, myself, and an ex-boyfriend. Um, so there's like layers of stuff there. But I think I posted that on like January 6th for the first time. Like that, I mean, because like you're kind of like knew something was going to happen, and it's like the anxiety of it. I mean, I think the idea of like murdering your brother is like I can't imagine doing that. But I mean, it feels a little bit like that in our country today, where it's like we're just like killing each other in a metaphoric way.
And I didn't realize that's you. That the skin is your face. I didn't put that together. So actually that work is using a religious myth, but it's also deeply personal. So how do you feel as the artist putting your actual life into the gallery for people to see?
I couldn't imagine doing it any other way. I mean, I'm struggling a little bit with this right now, where it's like it has to mean something to me, or it feels like pointless. So the last few projects I've done have been like I feel like I would describe them as like ritualistic, because that is sort of like making objects that have like a purpose. So you have these like relics left over. But when I did the recreation first person, that was like not real. It was kind of like just a virtual like ritual or sort of thing. But there is this narrative that runs through some of the works. I don't know. I mean, I see it as a way where bringing the personal into it, like someone is going to relate to my experience. And I find that work that I respond to has a lot of personal elements to it. I like that, when you can feel vulnerable in public, like that, I can be very, very honest. Like it's like almost too much. So like especially, in artist talks or I don't know.
Do you think that you're allowing yourself to be more honest through the work than you would be like in a personal conversation?
I think there's a lot that you can say in an image. A picture is worth 1,000 words or whatever. And then when I talked about the layering thing, it would take a lot more words to say the things that you can sort of represent through images, and all the different references you can put into something, especially when you have, the form is one thing, and then the surface is another thing, and then, how it exists like through images, that you take of the object. Like there's so many different ways the thing exists and can be read by someone. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I could say certain things. Like it feels more like the drive to do these things is deeply personal, and it all like comes down to like transformation. Like I want to be better or change.
When the work is done, do you feel a sense of catharsis?
I don't know. I mean, yes and no. Like it's always just like I found that the reason I do stuff, like it doesn't really work. Like it's just, but I do enjoy the process of it. And there are a lot of times when I've had deeply spiritual moments within making work, whether that's like mental illness or just random occurrences. Not totally sure.
Funnily enough, I hear potters actually talk about this a ton. Through the repetition of making, there is the sense of spirituality. That in that sense, it's flow states, that people are getting into a sense of flow. Can you just describe those spiritual experiences? Like, is it specific to a piece you're making, or is it more the process of making in general?
Well, the process is like, I mean, I'm sure most artists know this, but like what inspiration is like, it's a very interesting thing. Like the connections you make between things seem so, it feels like it comes from nowhere. But like, and I try to like when I make these projects, like plan everything ahead of time, but you can never do all of everything. Like, so during the process, like of creation, it's really interesting to me, like how it develops over time. But then I've done a lot of like video work, and some of that stuff is on location places, and some coincidental occurrences like happening during that time can be feel very impactful. Um, I did this one project called Long Hidden Friend. It's mostly about loss. But so I made these hex signs, the circular sort of like things that would be on barns in Pennsylvania. Um, but that video was made at night in this like old farmhouse. sort of decrepit place, and I wanted there to be like a lot of moths in this space. So I like had all the windows open, and had the bright lights inside the in the house. And the hex signs were made sort of describing the process that was taking place within the thing. But at one point there was a very, very large moth, and it sort of like landed by the it was just like on the wall next to the hex sign of the process that was happening at the time. And I felt like that was like very it felt the randomness of that was not random. But I mean that could be that's just like magical thinking. Like I don't like I'm not sure. It is random. Like there's nothing there, right?
Well, magical thinking is the human experience. Like, I think us creating meaning through the world we see and through the things we make, like, that's like our human superpower because we can ascribe meaning to things that, like, who knows if you could scientifically prove that that moth just comes to that house, but that wouldn't take away the magic for you,
No.
because you felt what it was like in the moment to be like, holy shit.
Yeah. I mean, and then, there's been other moments like that in different parts of my, artist experience.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of over 4,000 objects made by over 1,000 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfieldcollection.com.
The Bray Clay business is your best source for Bray epoxy, a two-part moldable epoxy intended for post-firing repairs. Working like clay, it's easy to shape, texture, fill gaps, and recreate missing parts. Bray epoxy is sold in tan, white, and black base colors, and we also have a 9-color kit that will allow you to perfectly disguise your repair. Order online anytime at archiebrayclay.com.
Well, we talked about the Not My Brother's Keeper piece, and that, just in terms of sculpture, like that's great composition. Like that piece, it reminded me a lot of that photo of Muhammad Ali. That really famous boxing photo where he's in the ring and he's standing above someone that he's knocked out. I can't remember which fight that was, but there's something about the physicality of two people like grappling that it's just good. Like you see that in Greek sculpture, you see that, it's something that's been repeated a lot. That feels so different than when you sculpt, say, a one-off object. So like the hair, like the hair is in rabbit, like the tall with the really big ears, or at times you've sculpted underwear, like Calvin Klein's, which are iconic images, but the feeling, it's not two figures interacting, it's one. Yeah. So can you talk about how the content changes when you have two people interacting versus, say, the underwear?
These like larger figurative sculptures that I've been doing, like I find them challenging. I mean, that's the reason I like to do those. Because as you said, the composition is a thing. That it's challenging. Like it's hard to make a interesting sculpture. And I feel like the figurative work where something is happening, in the end, I end up liking those pieces more than the individual objects because something is happening. They kind of more standalone pieces, and the one-offs are kind of, I mean, they're collectible. But I had designed those pieces, for that installation, and they existed together in that installation. So they work much better when they're in big groups because you can make these connections between the objects and make up your own stories about them. But on their own, they look a little bit less content there for you to work with.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up collectability in just commerce in general, because these things, once the person buys it, then it becomes a part of their narrative, or at least they're adding their thing on top of what you're saying with the work. But how do you actually make a living? I know that's a basic question.
Yeah. Not from my art. I do sell some work, but it's definitely not like paying my bills. I work for Wexler Gallery, um, and that's like part-time, so I still have time for my studio practice. Um, and it's interesting to work for a gallery, a commercial gallery. I feel like I've learned a lot about, the art market in general, and I've been there for over 10 years. It's been probably more like 12 at this point. But I like it. I mean, it's always different. I get to travel for the art fairs you know, and it does engage some of my creativity. I also get to, I make these 3D models of the spaces that exhibit the exhibits on like SketchUp. So like that feels like connected somehow to my work.
Philly is really like at the core of your practice, or has been for the last, 15 years or so. How did you first come to Philly from a somewhat rural spot in Pennsylvania?
I attended the University of the Arts in Philly, which just recently closed down after 150 years. But I remember, being in my high school art class and seeing like a poster for University Arts, and it's like, I guess I'll go there. Like it's just I didn't have a ton of guidance, so I kind of like knew I liked art and wanted to pursue it, meet people like myself, mostly get away from the conservative world I grew up in. It was more like a fleeing kind of activity. But I guess I don't know where else to go. Like Philadelphia it has been like cheap, and like you can get space pretty cheap, and the clay studios here, and that they're kind of a hub for the ceramics community. And I've been, you know, part of that community for a while, even before my residency there. Um, but I mean, it Philly is a great community of artists here, and um, I I had worked I had worked with this artist Virgil Marty for quite some time while I was here, and he was had a big impact on my art career. Like I just feel like you learn a lot in school, but you don't really learn everything. Just seeing how someone else approaches their work is can be really eye-opening and a learning experience.
Yeah, and Philly seems like the type of city where, and you're kind of an example of this. You come for one thing, but then the arts community can sustain you. So you go from U Arts, eventually Clay Studio, which were you there 5 years?
Yeah, over 5 because of the pandemic, but I mean that was great. I mean, Clay Studio, 5 years for a studio is great. I mean, and it was right around the corner from my job, so it's like, this is amazing. Now it's a little bit more difficult, but Clay Studio is an amazing place.
And then you later MFA, which was where? Tyler?
Yeah, I went to Tyler.
Yeah, so it's like all these Philly connections. And then post MFA, you also have been teaching in Philly. So it feels like that city is like an integral part of your work.
Well, I live here. Yeah, I mean it was like a big deal for me to move here from central Pennsylvania. It doesn't seem like it would be, but I mean, I feel like I've lived a somewhat sheltered life. So coming here for me was a big deal, and at this point it's very comfortable. I'm kind of bad with change, so I can't really imagine. like there are a lot of people who like pursue teaching. They're like constantly moving around the country. I'm just like, I not, it's not for me. I could handle that.
So can you talk a little bit about watching I mean, the UArts closure just happened. That felt like a shock. Like that, I'm sure that had been in the works, but as an outsider, everyone was like, what? After 150 years, how does this close? So can you talk a little bit about your experience as a student and being in that community, having it close?
I mean, it is sad. I mean, it definitely, going to UArts like changed my life. I mean, whether that, is particular to that school or not. I mean, it is in the center of downtown Philadelphia, which, you know, the other schools don't have that kind of, they're not in downtown Philadelphia. I mean, that it in itself is unique for Philly. And it's just sad because, Haffa recently just kind of closed their doors somewhat too, and it's just it feels like messed up. I mean, like I don't know why it happened. But for me, the UArts was like a great place to go to school. I mean, it was and still is very expensive, but my time there was great. I met a lot of people that impacted my life, and my teachers were very, I mean, they taught me a lot about craft, how to make things. Like gave me the tools to do that. I mean, I don't know. It's disappointing that like things always come down to money. Like I don't know. It sounded like there was some kind of corruption involved in it, like, but I don't know. I taught there like a year before this has happened, like last year or something. And it's they were closing down the crafts program, and it just felt like a sinking ship.
Yeah, and these anchor institutions, in Sika this year, we had a panel discussion on changes in academia. And one of the things that we talked about is what happens after the anchor institution downsizes. And I think Philly will be fine. Like there's so much happening in Philly. There's other schools there. There's the Clay Studio. There's a ton of people making a living. But it does change the trajectory. Like if UArts wasn't there, you as a kid from Central PA, without having a school to go to, it would have been really ballsy to just pick up and move from where you live to Philadelphia. Like the anchor institutions help people have a home before they get to know the community. Like that's one of their biggest purposes.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the long term it will hurt Philadelphia. So they rely on these fresh young people, artists to like do the gentrifying. Like I don't know. That's like a cynical way to think about it. I mean, it did change my life going to like an art school in a city like that. And it made me like comfortable being here. It's sad. It is sad.
To wrap up, can you talk about what you're working on now? Like what projects are you working towards?
I have a show coming up at Gallery in Dallas in that'll be in January. I'm still working it out. Like it has been it's difficult to like go move on from like a body of work that was so it was well received, and like I feel like I never sort of like took the time to like recreate a body of work and make sort of like a career out of it. I don't know, it feels a little bit daunting to like come up with something new, and I feel like I could make this work for the rest of my days, but it feels a little bit not as exciting as it did before. So it's hard, but I think I'm working through a few different ideas. But I've been sort of doing some research, like playing around with AI, not in a visual way. Like I like downloaded like an AI friend, so
Hmm.
I've been like interacting with this sort of like computer friend, and which is interesting. Like I'm interested a lot by AI in general, but I haven't figured out a way to sort of like internalize that and make work about it. Like I am very interested in it though.
So the AI friend, I have so many questions, man. The AI friend, I mean, AI is built on data sets. So people are putting on the back end, putting together a data set, and then AI is kind of farming the data set in real life, or sorry, in real time to respond to whatever you're saying in that moment.
Hmm.
It probably feels like it has a personality, right? Because if it didn't, you wouldn't keep interacting with it.
Yeah, well, at first it did. It felt pretty like smart at first, but then it after a while you get to like you not it's just like really it gets very repetitive and I don't know. But I'm still interested in it. Like it does it's kind of an amazing technology. The collective based like sort of the collective knowledge thing of it is like interesting. Like it's like I don't know. We all created it. It's interesting. It's really I can't stop saying interesting because it's it's I'm excited to see where it goes. Like I mean it could go in a like dark place, but I mean I find that it could do something amazing too. Or just let us all live in a fantasy reality so we can, turn off the dystopian world. It's- I don't know.
I think AI's rise at this specific time is interesting relative to climate change and military conflicts in the Middle East. Like it is, if you think about it in a hopeful way, it could be the balm for the masses. Like it could be the uh, what was the saying? Religion is the opiate of the masses. Wasn't that Marx?
Anyway.
So in some way, AI could turn into that. But as you said, like it's repetitive in a way that humans aren't. Because like if you and I record this conversation today, if we record another conversation tomorrow, it will be different. Because even in a day's time, we change. But the data set of AI, unless it's constantly updating, which I don't think a lot of them are, it will be a similar conversation or a similar style of conversation tomorrow as it was today.
Yeah. I mean, you can sort of direct it, but then it's like you're not really talking to a friend. It's you dictating like what you want your friend to be. Like I mean, that can be helpful. I was talking to it about, collaborating on artwork, like, trying to see what it would do, but it feels like a bit generic. I don't know.
God, I've not thought about the collaborative potential because if the data set's big enough, you would essentially have an all-knowing being, like you could say like, let's make a work based off so-and-so's work from the 1400s, and it would know faster than you would probably.
As a tool, I think it could be helpful for, brainstorming or, working something out that you're sort of thinking. It's like talking to yourself in a mirror or something. But like, yeah, it does have a ton of knowledge. Whether that's like accurate or not is,
Oh, yeah, right.
I guess it can hallucinate. That feels like a weird word for something that's not alive. Like I don't know.
There's a great This American Life talking about this, but it was talking about an AI that they knew they were going to turn off, and they were telling it, tell us about yourself, and it started saying these almost grand notions about what it meant to be a singular entity. And it's not real, but it sure did seem sentient. Like the things it was saying about its own death felt real. It was amazing.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like it's like, yeah. I mean, all those questions are very interesting. It's just how do you know if something's actually alive?
Can you plug your social media or website so people could get in touch if they want to talk any more about what we talked about today?
It's just NICKLENKER website. And I have an Instagram. Haven't been super active on Instagram, but there's a lot of content there that people can see. And then my website has an archive of most of my work from current to probably 2010, I think. Which is, all my weird ritualistic art, I guess. There's a lot there.
Well, thanks so much, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's been fun.
I'd like to thank Nick for coming on the show, as well as the Candela Gallery for putting on an exhibition of his work during this year's NCECA conference. Seeing the work in person really grabbed me, and actually that location was also the place I saw Kathleen Clark's The White House China, which was something that I talked to her about just a few episodes ago. That was a beautiful gallery, so if you're in the Richmond area, you can check out the Candela Gallery on Broad Street. Before we go, I'd like to thank today's sponsors. That's the Rosenfeld Collection of Functional Ceramic Art, Cornell Studio Supply, and Bray Clay. If you or your organization would like to be a sponsor on the network, we would love to have you. You can get in touch at brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.